All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am the dramatic historian, and we are back interviewing another great historian. But we're moving away from the Civil War to really discuss one of the most fascinating men in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. He's often cited as the world's greatest military leader and most influential political leader. His controversial leadership led to an outpouring of biographies that continue to dominate the field to this day. Napoleon's final days in 1814 often go unnoticed, with many preferring to read about his exploits or the failure at Waterloo the following year, or maybe they just prefer to listen to songs by ABBA. Who knows? Otherwise, I'm pleased to note that this gap in history did not go unnoticed by historian Dr. Ralph Ashby, who took the time to explore the complex nature of Napoleon's military decisions following the defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. The final frontier in France was all that Napoleon had left to defend, but it is Dr. Ashby who understands it best. So let's get into it. First and foremost, I actually am curious what drew you to the 1814 campaign in France? Because this is often overshadowed by his failed invasion in Russia, as well as, the Battle of Leipzig or his Italian campaign. What is it that drew you into that?
Yeah, no, I partly because I felt it had not received adequate attention, and I thought that perhaps some of the explanations for what happened were very brief and inadequate. So I was looking for something that needed more attention, that I could learn more about and put into some sort of sensible order. And it ended up, what I found fascinating about it when I went to the archives, what a lot of my book is actually about mobilization and logistics, which I tried to make as onboring as possible. And then I do discuss the campaign itself, of course.
And I suppose in the introduction of your book, you actually note that the campaign received far less attention than um, English language historiography. So, why do you think historians have actually tended to neglect 1814 largely?
Right. Right. Yeah, I found a lot more in French sources, obviously. Well, the English, you know, there's some excellent English histories of the Napoleonic Wars, but they do tend to focus on Waterloo and or the Peninsular War, where the British were most active. It stands to reason. Um, so that and you find this for every country involved in the Napoleonic Wars. They focus on what they did. Um, what I also found, at least, is kind of a previous generation of historians. They're mostly all gone now. Guys like Elting and Connolly, um, American historians who were very objective or tended to be pretty objective and covering a wider variety of campaigns. So those English language sources sometimes can be very useful.
Did you find that many of the histories on Napoleon, and this is me just genuinely curious. I
Yeah.
mean, did you tend to find that most histories were on uh, Waterloo or things of that nature? Just simply because I feel like given the fact that a whole movie was done on Waterloo in
Yes.
1970,
Right.
and as I mentioned before, you have the song by ABBA.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious, like, if part of that has to do with the pop culture, but also even for those people that really admired Napoleon, I feel like their direction is probably geared more towards like his really famous battles of Austerlitz, um, or his exploits in Italy.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's all of those things, you know. Waterloo is the most famous, at least in the English histories, for
Okay.
sure. And it
Okay.
dominates. And it's just an easy name. And it just, you know, if you ask people, it's ironic, isn't it? If you ask people to name one Napoleonic battle, if they can name only one, it's probably Waterloo. There's a
That's
song
probably right.
and a movie. Yes. uh, you know, so those people who
Uh,
are. Now, for the people who like
so
Napoleon, yeah, go on.
what was the central argument or misconception that you were hoping to challenge when writing Napoleon Against Great Odds?
Well, the one that comes up right away is the idea of war weariness, that um, they compare the invasions of France during the early wars of the Revolution and how, in theory, there was this massive uprising of French patriotism and they repelled the invaders, right? Whereas in 1814, the theory goes, after so many years of warfare, that the French population was exhausted, that they were tired of Napoleon, and they did not rise up to meet the invasion. I wanted to look at that because it didn't quite seem, it seemed a little simple, a little too neat and clean. And as I got into the research, I found that yes, it was a factor, but it wasn't the only factor. It was far from the only factor, and possibly not even the decisive factor. Um, that the problems Napoleon faced against what was a really huge invasion, much larger than the ones the French had faced in the early Revolution. One of the problems, the biggest problem Napoleon faced was material shortages, even more than shortage of personnel. Uh, Horse shortage, weapons shortage, equipment shortage, uniform shortage. As I started reading the inspection reports in the French military archives in Vincennes, the most common phrase was manque de, lack of harnesses, lack of boots, lack of muskets. And they had people, they had recruits in depots that they couldn't use because they couldn't equip them.
Hmm.
So that's a problem. No, you could have 5 times as
Yeah.
many volunteers; it wouldn't do you any good. So
Well,
that
I'll
was
make sure to
really
ask you
interesting.
about the horses later.
Yes, yes. As my advisor
So
said, it's
kind of
hard to grow a
leading,
horse.
yeah, right. No, well, um, at the end of 1813,
Yeah,
I should probably preface with you trying to, um, kind of explain this misconception within your book. I feel like that comes from a lot of the events that happened previously before Napoleon actually had to defend the borders of France. So, at the end of 1813,
right.
France faced an invasion from multiple directions. I mean, basically from all sides, something they hadn't seen since the French Revolution or the First Coalition that actually
Right.
took place. Um, there's hundreds of thousands of Allied troops that are actually approaching France. So, if you just want to briefly describe just how desperate was Napoleon's strategic position going into 1814?
Yeah. Yeah, it really was. And of course, a lot of that is the aftermath, as you mentioned before, the Battle of Leipzig, which, as some may know, was the largest battle in European history up until World War One. It was this massive battle in Saxony in Germany, and it turned out to be decisive in the sense that Napoleon lost a good chunk of his forces there. Many of his other forces were isolated in garrisons throughout Germany. And that was a double edged sword. On the one hand, the Allies moved to, well, some of them they had already had under siege, others they moved quickly to blockade or besiege. So Napoleon couldn't extricate those troops. He had no choice but to retreat back to France with whatever he had left. The Allies did try to block his retreat with a force, sort of a scratch force of Bavarians, um, and that was the Battle of Hanau. Fought the last battle Napoleon fights in Germany, and he was successful. He was successful in sweeping that aside and getting back to France, but with a badly depleted force. A very badly depleted force, which then, of course, suffered further from a outbreak of typhus. There was a typhus uh, epidemic, which continued throughout the campaign. So he had a grossly reduced force, just a fraction of what he had started the 1813 campaign with. Whereas the Allies, who had lost pretty heavily themselves, they had plenty to draw upon. And yeah, any delay the Allies suffered at that point in invading France initially was due to a couple of things: organizational, getting their stuff together, getting these big armies together after the battle, kind of reorganizing, blockading, besieging these isolated forces, and then they were finally able to mass these armies on the border. Then it was decision time. The coalition leaders argued amongst themselves: should we wait until spring? Because now it's winter. It's the beginning of 1814. It's January. Should we invade right away before Napoleon can raise new forces? Um, he was already doing that. The minute he got back in France, he knew he knew he needed a new army. That what he had was just so badly outnumbered that he had to somehow scrape together more troops. So that was the question. Um, it's an interesting point I considered in the book because had they waited until spring, Napoleon would have had a significantly larger army. Um, he was working on the supply shortages, which were actually, considering that France was so isolated at this point, geographically isolated, economically isolated. It's kind of surprising they did as well as they did in terms of putting together supplies for these the
Hmm.
existing troops and the new troops. They had to come up with food, weapons. They were repairing old muskets to try to get muskets. They were trying to manufacture new muskets. So they were addressing those as quickly as they can, but obviously that's a slow process. You can't just like crank out. It's not like they had assembly lines cranking out, hundreds of muskets a day. Couldn't really
Oh,
do
yeah, sure, sure.
that. But it's interesting. The Allies realized that the risk of invading in the winter, of course, was logistical. It's harder to wage a winter campaign.
And so, I mean, it sounds like that was a huge reason as to why mobilization was so ineffective within France at this moment in time. I mean, they were still able to scrape together a pretty significant force, though. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm curious though more about how much did Napoleon's own political standing in France affect the willingness of Frenchmen to actually go and fight in 1814?
That is a crucial question, right? Was it about politics or was it just um, the normal things that happen in wartime. And the fact that maybe his political reputation had been knocked down a peg or two after Russia and after Leipzig. Um, it's a little of all. It's a little of all of it. They're all factors. They all contribute. Um, there was the French legislature, which had been a rubber stamp up until this point, showed some signs of, hey, maybe we should say something. Maybe we should do something. Maybe this shouldn't be happening, and maybe Napoleon, Your Majesty, maybe this is kind of your fault that we're here like this. So that came into play. Um, but then I was looking at the history of conscription in France during the both the wars of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It's really interesting because, of course, from the early days of the French Revolution, one of the first things they did was institute conscription, a draft. Um, and the whole way they organized that was really interesting. They do it by departments. They classify the recruits by year of birth, and then you have these different classes. Normally, they're drafted 20 years after their birth year, which puts them at either 19, late 19 or early 20 is the typical age to be drafted. Um, there was always resistance to the draft from the beginning, all through the Wars of the Revolution, all through the Napoleonic Wars. And this can take several forms. Um, there's, I addressed the one thing is the marriage exemption. Um,
Oh,
if
yeah,
you
yeah.
get married and you're exempt, well, that was subject to obvious abuse. It's like, you pay somebody off to marry you. If she's a 70-year-old spinster, doesn't matter. Legal document, you're married, you're off the hook. And that happened all along. Um, there's, yeah. Then there's simply not reporting, right? Not reporting. You're drafted, you just don't show up. Now you're a deserter. Um, and this was nothing new either. Insoumis, they call them. They just, they don't show up. Then there's actual desertion. All this stuff. Physical disabilities, people actually maiming themselves to avoid the draft was a thing.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
yeah, you they would actually, since you had it even up until the Civil War, they're still tearing cartridges with their teeth. You knock out your front teeth, you can't tear a cartridge. You're ineligible for the draft. It's a high price to pay. um,
Yeah.
it's like, really? It's like, what? It's going to be that bad?
Right.
Sometimes the fear is kind of irrational, right? It's like these guys would in
Mhm.
their heads picture. Now, these were exceptions, right? It was always a thing. It always existed, but obviously it wasn't the majority. It was just always a thing that
Sure.
always resulted in the conscription not being 100% of people showing up for various reasons. So I was looking at it.
Were there certain were there certain areas of France where, you saw more resistance to the draft than in other regions?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's still there's still a lot of regionalism, you know. Well,
Okay,
heck, in the French Revolution, we have the revolt in the Vendée area, sort of like
right.
southeast of Brittany. Um, that rose up again. They talk about a draft riots. It's like the whole region was up in arms. And that actually happened again on a smaller scale in 1814. Um, certain areas, yeah, were less. The Bordeaux region had successfully relied on wine exports before the wars of the Revolution. Blockades and boycotts because of the wars hurt their economy. So they were never quite as enthusiastic about the revolution or Napoleon as some other areas of France. So you definitely get regionalism. It's definitely a factor.
Let's talk a little bit about the background of some of these soldiers. Based on these records that you examine, what can you actually say about these soldiers? You mentioned that they were 19 when they got drafted, but was that the average age? What was their occupation primarily? What did
Right.
that look like?
Yeah, that was a very common age, and it tends to be typical, but not universal. Um, Most of your people who get drafted, the most common single occupation was basically a worker, usually a rural worker, a farm worker who doesn't own land himself, hires himself out. This is common. This is for young males in France. It's a very common occupation. Some of them own land. Some of them are peasants who own land, but a lot of them, possibly no, definitely the single most common occupation. Um, you have other occupations, but that one's very, very common. You have some urban workers. Um, like I say, you have some landowning peasants of various means. Like I say, they're mostly right in around that 19 to 20-year age range. You do get some younger ones. Those that tend to be volunteers. And you do get some very, very
Huh.
young volunteers. Like as young as 16. Not a lot of those, but you
Oh,
do get some.
okay.
You do get some. You get some
Hmm.
older guys who, for various reasons, fell through the cracks in previous drafts, or the draft quota was such that it was fulfilled, and basically their number was never called. So, and Napoleon does it. You see him giving orders to go back to the older draft classes and redraft people that they missed before. So you do get some older guys. You do get some guys who are late 20s, 30s, even a couple early 40s. You get some of those. But your
Oh,
average age
wow.
is, yeah. um, but your average age is right in that 19-20 year uh, mark. The biggest exception are the National Guard guys, who can be a whole range of ages because they've been in the National Guard for a while in many cases. So a lot of those guys are later 20s, early 30s. They're a little bit older, although you're
Hmm.
going to have some younger guys too.
One of the striking parts of your book, and we've already touched on this, but you mention you talk a lot about how it really wasn't the manpower was not great, but it could have been worse. Um, but the biggest issue they had was logistics.
Yeah.
And how poorly equipped were these guys that were joining up, and how did it later affect their combat effectiveness?
Right. And that's one of the things I wanted to show. I wanted to link that directly to some of the events that happened on the campaign. Um, Clothing, now we're going to do a winter campaign here now. Um, is there going to be adequate clothing? The answer in many cases is no. Um, you you have basically, ideally, a soldier needs to be wearing some sort of linen shirts, whatever. Um, and then they typically wore a long sleeve vest. And then over the long sleeve vest, ideally, you have your uniform jacket, which is wool, and the uniform vest is wool. And over that, hopefully, ideally, the capote, the overcoat, a long woolen overcoat. So you got 3 layers of wool. Yes, you're going to be fine, except most of them didn't have that. They maybe had 2 out of 3 at best. So that's a problem. You're going to be cold. Foot gear, real important. Is there enough? No. um, You're supposed, ideally, a French soldier throughout the Napoleonic Wars, he had two spares of footgear in his backpack. Um, these guys, maybe one spare, probably no spares. So their footgear gives out at some point, and they're hors de combat. They're out of action because you can't really march in winter. I mean, bloody footprints aside, right? Um, the weather
Right. Yeah.
was a wild mix.
I know Napoleon is going to have some issues with that later during his fighting with the Allies in the 6 Days campaign. Um, but I previously mentioned this, but uh, Napoleon's cavalry had once been the best in
Yes,
Europe, arguably, right? And a
yes,
very dashing figures. You can find tons of artistic paintings of these French cavalrymen charging into battle, whether it be Marat or whoever.
right.
Well, that's changed a lot by
Oh, wow.
1814.
Yeah.
So, how badly did the disasters of 1812 and 1813 actually cripple the French cavalry arm?
It really did. And actually, when I was in the archives, that was some of the most fascinating inspection reports I read. Um, the shortage of horses, first of all. Napoleon had become very used to having sources for horses, all over Europe, pretty much. He could get horses from Germany, he could get horses from Italy. Um, there was always plenty of horses. Famously, so many horses died in the Russian campaign, ended up being used for food in many cases. Um, the horse losses were also bad in the 1813 campaign. Worse is he couldn't draw on these anything outside of France for horse replacements now. There there are no horse replacements from Germany, obviously. There's no horse replacements from anywhere except France. And in many cases, like I say, you can build a musket, you can't build a horse, right? uh, you can, get horses to have baby horses, but that's not going to do you any good. So there's a really
No.
limited number of horses. Then there's types of horses, right? You got your draft horses that you need for your artillery, that you need for your wagons. And then you have different sizes of horses for your heavy cavalry, your light cavalry. Well, that's a luxury at this point. In 1814, they're having trouble getting horses at all for the recruits. A lot of guys who volunteer or even who are drafted for purposes of cavalry uh, replacements, or they volunteer. They want to be one of those glamorous cavalrymen. They go to the depot there, the main cavalry depot at Versailles, and they spend the campaign waiting around for horses. There were there were thousands of recruits at Versailles who never got horses. Um, Huge problem. So that's a wastage of manpower right there, as it turned out, available manpower that was never used because they just couldn't get the horses, and and getting the equipment was a problem too. I was actually just looking at that again in my book, which pretty well written. I don't know, but the uh, the horses was one problem. Again, the uniforms were a problem. Um, the one I forget which regiment it was. They said, "Oh yeah, they have everything they need. They're mounted. They have all their equipment, except their trousers are too short." So I had this comical image of these guys with the high waders on, riding off to war. But they were actually lucky because a lot of guys they couldn't get enough weapons. They couldn't get the uniform items. Again, footgear. Another item that cavalry needs and artillery is harnessing. You don't think about that. The leather harnessing. If you don't have leather harnessing, you don't have a horse you can use. So all these things, it was a huge problem.
Hmm. Well, I'm just surprised that we didn't hear of Marat taking all the horses he could off to Italy to go defend his own kingdom with them. So I don't know. I was surprised to not see that.
Yeah,
You had mentioned artillery, and look, I think most people that know about Napoleon, man, Napoleon loved artillery. That was like
right.
his bread and butter. In 1814, was it still as dominant as it had been earlier in his career?
Right. Yeah. Again, he ran into a problem here. It was still good, but he had lost a lot of artillerymen over the campaigns. And artillery is something that requires a little bit of skill, a little bit of experience, and he had lost a lot of that. Um, so he had some artillery that was still very good, but some ended up being, well, subpar. And he had to sort of, again, as in a lot of things, he had to kind of scrape stuff together to try to form artillery units or reinforce artillery units. Horses is one problem, but trained artillery, it was a problem. He did end up pulling a lot of people off the coastal batteries, which was a separate kind of artillery, obviously. Coastal guns are a different animal. They're not really field artillery, right? They're not used to operating in battle, but they knew how to load and
Right.
shoot. So he used a lot of those guys, but and then on the field of battle, sometimes they don't know how to protect themselves. They don't know how to protect their caissons, their ammo wagons. So when they actually become engaged in battle, there's at least one account where their ammo wagons get hit, and that's a disaster. Obviously, it basically wipes out the battery. So yes,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, and you can only train these guys so fast for the
Right.
conditions of
Yeah,
the
well, and
campaign.
I it sounds like Napoleon was really scraping the sides of the barrel, literally trying to put anything together.
Yeah,
But what I think one of the interesting parts that you get into of your book is that when it comes to the defense of France, it involved not only the soldiers but the civilians as well. How did the French civilians actually react to the ongoing Allied invasion at the time?
yeah, that proved to be really fascinating when I was studying that. That there was an expectation that there might be civilian resistance, partisan activity. It In most
Yeah.
cases it didn't start right away. In a few cases it did, but in most cases, once the Allied soldiers actually come into France and start
Hmm.
requisitioning, again, this winter campaign, they start requisitioning local supplies. Um, at that
Okay.
point, your French locals are going, wait a minute, this is not good. This is worse than we thought it was going to be. Again, they probably should have expected. And then, even
Right.
worse than requisitioning food and clothing and outright stealing the stuff, there were poorly behaved Allied soldiers um, who would uh, do terrible things to the local inhabitants, the things you see in wartime: robbing,
Hmm.
stealing, plundering, burning, raping. The more that happened, the more you see partisans start to pop up. Um, this is a pattern you see in any war, any campaign. This You see this happen, and this campaign
Right.
followed the same pattern. Um, and I do note the one exception when Wellington invades southern France. Um, he he had done this before. He strictly punishes any looting. It's absolutely forbidden. His policy was pay for everything, don't abuse the local population. It's common sense, actually, but you need to have a pretty
Yeah.
disciplined army. Um, so in that case, and they got as far as Bordeaux, which, as I mentioned before, was not a Bonapartist stronghold anyway, and they're paying for everything. So, but all the other armies
That
behaved. Yeah, I mean it's a big deal.
well, it's interesting that Wellington, of all people, ordered that when he's calling his own soldiers the scum of the earth. So, I just find that a
Yeah.
little bit ironic. Civilians did resist in some places. Other towns were
Yes.
more open to this Allied invasion. What explains the different reactions to this?
Yeah. I mean, some of it's just the a reaction, an angry reaction against the Allies. Um,
Yeah.
some is just circumstances. Some of these towns are besieged, and the civilians are just stuck there. So they do the best they can in some cases. In many cases, they help with the defense of the town. You do see other situations where Napoleon gets the help, not behind enemy lines, but from the local population in gathering supplies or helping him in at least one case build a bridge because his bridging train wasn't available. Um, so you do get sympathetic civilians in a lot of cases. Again, regionalism is part of this, but also it's a reaction,
Okay.
especially in the cases where Napoleon does win a couple victories, re-enter a town such as Troyes, and then the people are happy to see him, because the Allies were behaving terribly. So, in that case, they view it as a liberation.
Let's get into the kind of more of the meat of your book, and honestly, probably what our listeners are really wanting to know about, which is
Yeah,
some of the battles, some of the engagements that obviously take place during the Allied invasion. And I think one of the most famous parts of Napoleon's career is his 6 days campaign in February of 1814.
right.
It's I know some historians like Legere have called it Napoleon's one of his greatest operational masterpieces. What was it that made this short campaign against the Allies so remarkable?
Yeah, I mean, you do see Napoleon at his best. He recognizes situations, he recognizes opportunities, like immediately. Um, you know, I know you study Grant a lot. The one thing both of them had, I think, in strategic terms, is they could picture the map. They could always see it in their head.
Yeah.
Um, and so when the Allies, after they had won a couple of battles earlier in the campaign, they got a little overconfident. They split their forces. They pushed ahead aggressively. Part of this was logistics, supply things. But once they and Napoleon had pretty decent local intelligence too. That he is in France now, so he has pretty good local intelligence. So he recognizes the opportunity to strike isolated parts of coalition troops, and he is on it. And the other thing, while his army is small, what he has is a nice, smallish, hard-hitting force. And they're pretty enthusiastic. The troops he does have, yes, a lot of them are badly equipped, badly trained, but they're they're willing. They're willing, and they march forward. Um, so as he sees these different elements of the Allies coalition armies, he's able to hit, and to catch them. He has the element of surprise in some cases, concentration of force, um, and like I say, a nice, potent little army that he uses to absolute optimal effect. It really, it rivals what he did in Italy. Um, This hard hitting, fast maneuvering, recognizing the situation and using what he has to best effect. And yeah, it's impressive. It's impressive on his part. It's impressive on the part of the troops.
This completely rivals what Napoleon did in Italy. And I know a lot of military planners and soldiers that are looking to become officers. It's very common for them to study Napoleon's Italian campaign just simply because operationally it was brilliant. I'm almost curious to know if they also study the 6 Days campaign simply because it's very impressive in the way of, okay, well, he has fewer men, he's beating them back to back to back. I'd be curious to know if military planners actually study that campaign by itself. But I actually wanted to ask you, um, which of the battles do you consider the most? Which of those do you
Ooh,
consider the most impressive examples
wow,
of Napoleon's battlefield skill?
wow. That's a good question. I don't know if I ranked him like that. Um, I think in terms of his skill, they're all impressive in the sense that he adjusts to the situation. So, for example, something people think he never did, he does do. He commits old guard troops in a couple cases um, because the situation called for it. Yeah, gosh, I never really ranked them. That's a great question, though. I might have to go back and look at that and decide which one I rank. So, this isn't always possible in Napoleonic battles. You get pursuit, but you don't always get a maneuver to cut them off. Um, and you had that here. You had a maneuver anticipating, not only flanking them, but actually, and not just threatening their rear, actually blocking their rear. Um, which, of course, isn't going to be a total blockage. A lot of them are still going to retreat. A lot of them are still going to get away. But once you've got an enemy retreating, or in some cases routing, and then suddenly Frenchmen on horses show up from another direction, now they start laying down their arms. Now you've bagged a bunch of prisoners, um, and that's a nice, quick, easy way to whittle down the odds a bit. So again, it was
If
just yeah, it was good.
if Napoleon was able to win these victories, I mean, back to back to back, why couldn't they save France?
Yeah, because the Allies had too many troops. These were isolated parts of the Allied army. They had plenty more. Where that came from, it's mostly against Blucher's army. Schwarzenberg, um, the army of the Bohemia, as they called it. Napoleon was still going to have to deal with that. Um, so that was a whole other army he had to deal with. And then the other thing they did after Blucher kind of got his ass handed to him, frankly, uh, and had been driven back, um, he's they take troops away from Bernadotte, the Army of the North, and give them to Blucher, basically replacing all his losses because the Army of the North wasn't doing much anyway. So they had such ample resources. Now, it did, these were, any victory Napoleon saw had positive political aspects to it and diplomatic aspects. The theme I come back to several times in the book is Napoleon's diplomacy in this campaign was terrible. It was possibly his worst failure. So after he won these victories, yes, um, there's some peace feelers, right? There's okay, maybe we can
Yeah.
negotiate real quick here now. But he wasn't willing to adjust his ask his asking price for peace. He was very inflexible when it came to terms. Um, he basically was insisting on the same terms as he had even before the campaign started, and that was not very realistic. He was overestimating his hand and the value of these victories. Basically, if he had adjusted his terms, lowered his terms, maybe, maybe those battles could have saved him. But he wouldn't. So the coalition adjusted. They moved some stuff around, and they just carried on because they knew um, they had the troops to do it. Um, they also realized that they had been overconfident, that they had let their guard down, that they had opened themselves up for these defeats by Napoleon that Napoleon had inflicted upon them. Woke them up. It woke them up. They realized Napoleon's still dangerous and not to be trifled with. So, unfortunately for Napoleon, didn't work out long term.
What were the borders that they were debating or disagreeing on? What was it that Napoleon wanted versus what the Allies were offering him?
Right, right. Um, at initially he kept talking about the natural frontiers. Well, what's the natural frontier? Um, the whole Rhine River is the natural frontier. Italy is the natural frontier, or something like that. It's like
The
he wanted
Roman
as much.
Empire.
Yes, and he does lower it somewhat. Then there's the then you can go to the 1794 borders or the Allies were talking about the 1791 borders, the pre-revolution borders. I mean, to them, the biggest thing they had to offer was Napoleon gets to keep his throne. He gets to stay in power. Um, the other part, the alternative, is he doesn't get to stay in power. Um, the Allies could press that issue. And again, you had there was some division among the coalition leaders. Um, the Austrian emperor was fine with Napoleon staying in power because technically Napoleon is his son-in-law. His daughter is the Empress of France. So I said, okay,
Right,
you can stay in power, but I get Italy. So
right.
it's like either I get Italy or my daughter's an ex-empress. That's fine too. Uh, Alexander, Tsar
So,
Alexander, he didn't want Napoleon in power anymore.
yeah, that's not surprising. Did
He
if Napoleon had agreed to, I don't know, let's say the Austrian emperor's proposal,
right.
uh, does Napoleon stay emperor of France? Was that a realistic option for the Allies if he came back and said, "Yeah, I'll do that"?
It's a great question because what at the very least it would have thrown the coalition into political disarray. There's no guarantee he would have been able to hang on to it because some of the parties were insistent that he be gone. But if the Austrians aren't so sure about that, now you've got a situation where, all right, um, what do we do then? What do we do? We negotiate something else, So it's interesting. It's a counterfactual, of course, because Napoleon wouldn't lower his demands,
Right,
but
yeah.
yeah, he wouldn't be Napoleon, I guess. Um, so.
That's right.
You
He
know,
won it.
he just wouldn't be him, right? But yeah, had he agreed, it's interesting because they would have had a pause, a moment, and hammer some kind of agreement. Famously, Tsar Alexander said, "You know, next time I might not be willing to bring an army all the way to the Rhine River again." Um, so he like, you know, this
It
is my bargaining chip.
it really could have changed so much, but Napoleon wouldn't be Napoleon if he didn't get what he wanted, in those agreements, and he was so used to it. He always
Yes,
won, and now
yes,
he's on the other side of it where it's like, I don't really know what to do here.
yeah. Well,
But
famously, he says
if
when he finally does abdicate, he says, "I abdicate and yield nothing." In other words,
yeah,
if any territory was going to be lost, it was going to be on the next guy. It wasn't going to be on him.
yeah, that's right. That's right. As we actually start to, wrap up here, I
Yeah,
think one of the big questions that I always ask every historian that comes on is if listeners or even readers,
yeah.
take away one lesson from the campaign of 1814, what should that be based upon what you wrote?
I think I think what they should take away is it's more complicated than they might think going in. That it's interesting because it's complicated. There's surprises. There's things you wouldn't necessarily expect. Um, History is complicated. You know, we try to simplify it to make it easy to understand. You know, you want to try to make things clear. If you're teaching a class, right, you're trying, all right, I got to present this, it's got to be clear. The danger is you want to avoid oversimplifying things. And what I found, that initial explanation of 1814, oh, France was tired, war exhaustion. No, no, no. There's way more to it than that. This was a tough campaign. It was a short campaign, but it was very complex. A lot of moving parts. The wide variety of troops involved. Again, for the military enthusiasts, it's fascinating to see the different performances of untrained troops or semi trained troops, poorly equipped troops, in different circumstances. In some circumstances, they're very effective. On the battlefield, when things are going according to plan, they're remarkably effective. If they're surprised, or if the situation is not the usual, now not so much. Now they fall to pieces. That's just very interesting, just from a military standpoint, to sort of look at unit effectiveness and why a unit is effective and in what circumstances. Same thing, actually, too. I don't study the Allies as much. I'm mostly focused on the French army, but similar circumstances on the other side sometimes. You see a wide variety of performance and effectiveness from the Allies, too, just from a operational and tactical standpoint. So it's a complicated and interesting, short, kind of brutal campaign.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity. Looking at my book again after a long time, um, and the font was, I'm getting old, right? So um, need the glasses. Uh, yeah, but it holds up pretty well. I read it and said, oh, the guy who wrote this he's not a bad writer. He's okay. But
Again, we're here with Dr. Ralph Ashby. He is the author of Napoleon Against Great Odds. I highly recommend you go check out his book. Go buy it if you can. But otherwise, if you need a fix for history, make sure to go check out History Fix. And I'll make sure to be posting this on my channel here within the next, hopefully within the next week. But otherwise, everyone have a great Saturday.
thank you.